The causeway to Marsh Carr was not built for the faint of heart, and at dusk, with the mist coming up off the reed beds like breath off a sleeping thing, it scarcely seemed built at all. Hester Maddox set one flat black shoe before the other on the wet stone and did not look down at the black water on either side, because she had learned long ago that one does not steady oneself by looking at the thing that frightens. She kept her grey eyes level on the dark bulk of the hall ahead, where a single window burned a thin amber, and she drew her dark wool cloak close at the throat against the damp that smelt of mud and rot and the cold green breath of standing water. Somewhere out in the drowned fen a heron rose with a slow, heavy creak of wings, a grey ghost against a greyer sky, and folded itself away into the reeds, and the sound it made was like a hinge that had not been oiled in 100 years. She carried her own small box upon her shoulder, for no man had come out to take it from her, and the cord at her waist held a worn brown leather pocketbook that knocked softly against her hip with every step, a small private heartbeat that only she could hear. She was 28, and she was tired in the particular way of a woman who has watched at many bedsides, and she was. As the world reckoned such things, nobody at all, a paid nurse, smelling faintly of camphor and tallow, sent for out of the parish because the great old Lord Ferrymore was dying and would have a watcher by him, and no fine lady would soil her hands with the work. The causeway narrowed, and the moat opened wide and black around the old moated grange, and the mist hung over it, so that the hall seemed to float upon the water like something that had risen and might at any hour sink again. Marsh Carr. She said the name once to herself, soundlessly, the way one notes a thing one means to remember, and went on. A bell hung beside the studded oak door, but its rope was furred green with damp, and when she pulled it, the sound came small and choked, as though the house resented being woken. She waited. The wind moved in the reeds with a long, dry hiss. At last there were bolts drawn back, 3 of them, each a separate complaint, and the door swung in upon a hall so dim that for a moment she saw nothing but the cold of it, a held breath of stone and old smoke. A spare, upright woman of some 60 years stood within, a candle lifted in a work-worn hand, iron-grey hair drawn tight beneath a frilled white cap, and her deep-set brown eyes went over the newcomer once, quickly, taking the measure of the slate-grey stuff gown, the plain white apron, the box upon the shoulder, the chapped, reddened hands. "You'll be the nurse," the woman said. It was not unkind, but it was not warm either. It was only true. "I am Hester Maddox," said Hester, and drew her slow breath and let it go, and inclined her head. "I was sent for to attend Lord Ferrymore." "I'm Mrs. Druitt, housekeeper here." She stood back to let her in, and the great door closed behind them with a sound like a coffin lid, and the bolts went home one by one. The hall within was long and low-beamed, and panelled in oak gone almost black with age and water, and the damp lived in the wood so that it shone faintly in the candlelight, as if it sweated. Down the length of it the Ferrymore portraits hung in their tarnished frames, dim faces in ruffs and armour and powder, lords and ladies of a proud old house, their painted eyes following the candle as it passed, their mouths set in the same close cold line that the living wore. A long case clock ticked somewhere in the dark with a slow waterlogged sound. The whole place breathed of standing water and tallow and the faint sweetish rot of a house too long shut against the fen, and Hester, who had a fine nose for sick rooms, thought, there is death in this house already, in the very walls, and only the form of it remains to be settled. Mrs. Druitt led her up by a turret stair that wound tight and cold in the thickness of the wall, each step worn into a shallow cup by long dead feet, and as they climbed there came down to them voices from above, light, easy voices. The voices of people warm and well-fed and amusing themselves. They were in the great chamber that opened off the head of the stair, the antechamber to the sick room, and the door stood ajar upon firelight and candle glow, and 3 men who turned as the nurse came up out of the dark. The first was tall and well-made, and at his ease in a deep claret coat, a man perhaps 33 with thick dark hair fallen carelessly at the brow and quick dark hazel eyes that found her at once and held a lazy amusement. This, she would learn, was Lord Adrian Ferrymore, the heir, who lounged against the chimney-piece with a glass in his hand, as though the dying overhead were a tedious play he was obliged to sit through. The second was sleek and soft and middling, in a bottle-green coat a shade too rich and a yellow waistcoat, his black hair pomaded flat and receding at the temples, and he raised a quizzing-glass on a black ribbon to his eye and looked at her through it as one looks at a specimen. That was Mr. Julian Crail, the cousin. The third was portly and short and red of face, full of his own importance in an old-fashioned black coat with a buff waistcoat straining at its buttons, a gold-headed cane between his knees and a gold snuff-box in his fingers, Dr. Pelham Swett, the physician. 3 pairs of eyes went over her, and 3 faces arrived, by 3 different roads, at the same conclusion, which was that nothing of any consequence had entered the room. "Ah," said Dr. Swett, taking a pinch of snuff and dusting his fingers, the nurse. "I had said we should have one. Come in, woman, and do not stand dripping in the doorway." Mr. Krell let his glass fall on its ribbon and smiled his thin, too-ready smile. "From the parish, is she?" "One can always tell. There is a particular," he wrinkled his long nose delicately, "a particular perfume to charity, is there not? Camphor, I think, and tallow." For Lord Adrian laughed, not cruelly but easily, the laugh of a man to whom the discomfort of an inferior is a small free amusement costing him nothing. "Leave her be, Julian. She has come a wet road. What is your name, nurse?" "Maddox, my lord. Hester Maddox." "And your people, Maddox?" asked Crail, smooth as butter. "What Maddoxes are these? Of what county?" One likes to know the breeding of the creature one trusts a dying man to. There was a small silence, and into it Hester drew her slow breath and lowered her grey eyes a half-beat, so that her calm arrived before her words. "I have no family living, sir," she said quietly. "I have my hands and my training, and I have nursed gentlefolk and poor folk both, and I do not let my patients want for care. That is all the breeding I can offer you." She said it without heat and without apology, and somehow the very evenness of it made the 3 men feel, for the briefest instant, that they had struck at something that would not break, and did not like the feeling, and laughed the louder to be rid of it. "No family," cried Swett, delighted. "A nurse of no family. Why, she might be anybody. She might be nobody. She might have crawled up out of the fen with the eels. Mind she does not make off with the spoons, Adrian or the seal," murmured Crail, and there was something underneath the words that did not match the likeness of them. But no one marked it but Hester, who marked everything. Lord Adrian only smiled and waved his glass toward the inner door. "Go in to my uncle, then, Maddox of no family. He is your business, not your betters." Druitt, show her, Mrs. Druitt's thin, firm lips had pressed tighter and tighter through all of this, and now she set her candle on the table with a small, decided click, and took up another and said, "This way," in a voice that dared the 3 gentlemen to remark on her tone. She drew Hester through the inner door and shut it firmly behind them, shutting out the warm, careless voices, and they stood together in the hush of the sick room of the east turret. It was a round room, stone-walled, hung with old crimson curtains gone the colour of dried blood, and at its centre stood the great tester-bed, a vast carved canopy of black oak with its hangings half drawn, and within that cave of shadow, propped high upon a bank of bolsters, lay the dying Lord Ferrymore. He was a very old man, near 80, and the illness had wasted him down almost to the bone, so that his skin lay translucent over his temples, and his cheeks were fallen in, and his hands upon the white counterpane were long and yellow and frail as the claws of a bird. A few wisps of fine white hair escaped his nightcap. A faded crimson banyan of figured silk was laid about his thin shoulders. A single candle burned at the bedside, and a low fire muttered on the hearth. The room smelt of fever and beeswax, and the bitter medicines on the side table, and over all the eternal damp of the fen seeping through the stone. Hester crossed to him without haste, set down her box, and took up the candle to look at him as a nurse looks, and as she bent over him, the old man's eyes opened. They were pale watery blue, those eyes, sunk deep in the wasted face. And at first they wandered, clouded, but as they found her face they cleared, all at once, the way the surface of the moat had cleared between two breaths of mist on the causeway, and what looked out of them then was not the failing wits of a sick old man, but a sharp, shrewd, living intelligence that took her in and weighed her and was not deceived. "You are not one of them," said Lord Ferrymore. His voice was a thread, but it was a clear thread. "Hush, my lord. Save your strength. I am the nurse." Hester, Hester, he tried the name, and a ghost of satisfaction moved over the ruined face. "A good plain name. Come closer, girl, where I can see you. They have sent me a great many people who smile, and I am very tired of being smiled at." She drew the stool close and sat, and felt his pulse at the bird-thin wrist, light and uneven, the pulse of a clock running down. "I shall not smile at you, my lord, unless there is something to smile at," she said, "and I shall not lie to you, which I think is what you are truly asking." The old eyes held hers a long moment. Out in the antechamber, Crail's laugh came thin through the oak. The old lord's gaze flicked toward the door and back, and something hardened and grew watchful in it. "No," he said softly, "you shall not lie to me. And I think, Hester, that you are a woman who can keep a thing close." He had not the strength for more. His eyes drifted shut, but his frail hand had found hers upon the counterpane and held it, light as a leaf, and unwilling to let go. And so she sat, and so the first thin thread was spun between the watcher and the watched, the only honest soul in the house, and the only honest soul left in it to value her. He slept at last, and Mrs. Druitt, who had stood by the door all the while with her hands folded and her brown eyes soft for the old man, and hard for the closed antechamber, beckoned Hester out by a second small door that gave on a back passage and led her up another half-flight to a narrow cold chamber under the leads that was to be her own. It was scarce more than a cell, a truckle bed, a deal washstand, a rush chair, a small grate with no fire laid in it, a window of thick green glass that looked out on the black water and the reeds. "It is poor enough," the housekeeper said, with the first softening Hester had heard from her, "but it is clean, and I will see you have a candle and your supper, and a warmer welcome than they gave you below." The old lord was a hard man in his day, but a just one, and these she did not finish, only pressed her lips, and her glance went down toward the warm voices, and she shook her head and went away, and her keys chimed faintly down the stair. Hester barred the door. She set her candle on the washstand, and for a little while she did not move at all, but stood listening to the house, the slow tick of the great clock far below, the mutter of the men, the long ceaseless hiss of the wind in the reeds, the small secret slap of the moat against the foot of the wall. Then she sat down upon the edge of the truckle bed and unhooked the worn brown leather pocketbook from the cord at her waist and opened it upon her knee. From an inner fold she drew 2 papers, both worn soft as cloth from much careful handling. The first was a long document of several leaves engrossed in a clerk's close hand, stamped and sealed, and it was a bond, a mortgage upon the whole estate and manor of Marsh Carr and all the lands of the Ferramores, made out years since when the old pride had borrowed against itself once too often, with its covenants of interest, its right of redemption, and its power of foreclosure, should the debt fall due unpaid. She read it slowly in the candlelight, though she knew it now by heart, her grey eyes moving down the clauses with the unhurried care she gave to everything. And she came, as she always came, to the place where the present holder of the bond was named, the one who might at law call in the whole sum and turn the proud house out of doors or take its lands entire. And the name written there, brought up quietly through a trustee these 18 months past, while the Ferramores laughed in their warm rooms and never knew, was her own. Hester Maddox. The second paper was a letter from the trustee, a dry man of business in Lincoln, confirming that the conveyance was complete, that the bond stood absolute in her name, and that the matter remained, as she had instructed, entirely secret. She sat with the 2 papers open upon her knee, and the candle throwing her long shadow up the cold stone wall, and below her in the warm chamber, the heir of Marsh Carr laughed again at some jest of the cousins, and called her, no doubt, the nurse of no family, the nobody smelling of tallow, who might make off with the spoons. She did not smile. She felt no triumph. She was too tired and too honest for that, and she had not bought the thing for triumph. She folded the 2 papers again along their soft, worn creases, slowly, and slid them back into the inner fold of the pocketbook, and snapped the little brass clasp, and hung it once more upon the cord at her waist, where it knocked, soft and secret, against her hip. Then she rose and washed her chapped hands in the cold water, and went down by the back stair to sit her first night beside the dying old man, who was the only soul in all that drowned, proud house to guess that the plain grey nurse was anything at all. And she said nothing, to him or to any of them, of the name upon the bond, and meant to go on saying nothing, until the day the saying of it should be the only thing left that could save them. They came at noon the next day, sweeping down the long causeway in 2 carriages, with the wet fen wind streaming the steam off the horses, and the whole drowned hush of Marsh Carr seemed to flinch at the noise of them. Hester heard the wheels first from the sick-room window, the suck and clatter of iron tires on the half-flooded road, the shout of a coachman, the bright, careless laughter of people who had never in their lives been afraid of a quiet house, and she set down the cup she had been warming over the spirit lamp, and went to the casement and looked out across the moat at the dark line of them coming, and drew her slow breath, and let it go, and turned back to her old man on his bolsters, as though nothing at all were arriving. Below, Mrs. Druitt's keys were already going down the stone passage at a clip, and Jem was being chivied out to take the horses, and the great hall that had stood empty and echoing for a fortnight filled all at once with boots and voices and the smell of cologne and wet wool and brandy. They did not come up to the sick-room directly. They dined first. She heard them at it, the long muffled roll of talk, and the chime of glass coming faint up the turret stair, while she sponged the old lord's temples, and read to him in a low, even voice from the psalms he liked, and he lay with his pale, watery eyes half open, listening less to the words than to the steadiness of her, his long, bony hands quiet on the counterpane. It was near 3 before the door was flung open without a knock, and the heir came in with his company at his heels, bringing the whole bright cold world of them into the close camphor-smelling dark. Lord Adrian Ferramore filled the doorway, and ducked his dark, overlong head under the lintel and came in with the loose, easy stride of a man who had never had to ask leave of any room in his life. He had thrown off the many-caped greatcoat somewhere below. He stood there in the deep claret tailcoat and the buff and cream-striped waistcoat and the high, carelessly knotted cravat, his hazel eyes going round the dim chamber with a flicker of distaste he did not trouble to hide, his firm, mobile mouth already half-curled with the private amusement of a man come to be diverted. "Well, uncle," he said, too loud for a sick room, "they tell me you are dying. You look it." And he laughed a little, lightly, at his own hardness, as though daring the room to be shocked, and the others laughed with him because he was the heir, and the laughter was expected. Behind him came Dr. Pelham Sweat, portly and short and high-coloured, strutting in on his silver-buckled shoes with the gold-headed malacca cane swinging, his snuff-dusted buff waistcoat straining its buttons over his belly, his small, shrewd, pale eyes already raking the room for fault. And behind the doctor, sleek and smooth and last, came Mr. Julian Crail, the cousin, in his bottle-green coat a shade too rich, and his yellow-figured waistcoat, his pomaded black hair brushed flat to a gleam, lifting the quizzing glass on its black ribbon to his eye as he came, so that one small dark eye swam huge and cold behind the lens as it travelled over the bed, over the medicines, and at last over the nurse who stood at the bolster with the sponge still in her reddened hand. It was Sweat who opened the sport, because a doctor before company must always be seen to know better than whatever has been done in his absence. He bustled to the bedside, set 2 fat fingers to the old man's wrist, made a great pursing of his lips, took up the glass on the night table and held it to the light and sniffed it and set it down with a small contemptuous click. "Camphor and tallow and barley water," he said to the room rather than to her, "and cold cloths, the good old kitchen physic. Pray, woman, who ordered these?" Hester let the half-beat come, the slow breath, the lowering of her grey eyes a moment to the counterpane, and up again, so that her calm reached them before her voice did. "The cloths are mine, sir," she said evenly. "The draught is the one Dr. Sweat wrote himself on Tuesday. I have it by." And she drew the folded paper from under the cup and held it out to him plainly, without colour or sting, and Sweat's high colour went a shade higher, for it was indeed his own crabbed hand, and he had forgot it, and he took it and crushed it into his fob and said only, more sourly, "Well, it does no harm, I dare say, in such hands as these." He took out the gold snuff-box and flourished it, and helped himself with a great fastidious pinch, as a man does who has been answered and must make a small noise to cover it. Kral found that delicious. He let the quizzing glass fall on its ribbon and clasped his soft white hands and came a half-step nearer the bed, scented and smiling. "Such hands as these," he repeated, "soft as cream." And he looked down at Hester's hands, the long, capable fingers, the knuckles cracked and reddened raw from cold water and tallow and the chap of the fen wind. And he made his thin, too-ready lips into a mow of dainty pity. "My poor good creature," he said, "they have quite ruined you, these labours. Look, Adrian, look at the nurse's hands. One would think she had been at the wash-tub and not at a gentleman's bedside. There is a deal to be said, after all, for keeping to one station. A lady's hands are a lady's fortune, and a servant's are her." Testimonial, he smiled round at them, pleased with the word. The heir, lounging now against the carved bedpost with his arms folded and one boot crossed over the other, looked at the hands too, idly, the way a man looks at a curiosity, and his mouth quirked. Hester did not hide them. She did not clasp them behind her apron as a younger or a vainer woman might. She drew her slow breath and lowered her eyes the half-beat to the chapped backs of her own hands and raised them again, level and untroubled, to Creel's swimming eye. "They are clean, sir," she said, which is the chief thing wanted at a sick bed. And she dipped the sponge again and wrung it and laid it cool on the old man's forehead in front of all of them. And the small, mean silence that followed was hers and not theirs. So it went, the long, cruel quarter of an hour of it, the smart company baiting the nurse for sport while the dying man lay between them like a stone in a stream. They held up her plain slate grey stuff gown, stuff in a great house, one had not thought to see it, and her unfrilled linen cap, and the worn silver band on her right hand that was no wedding ring, and gave them leave to wonder aloud, smiling, whether there had ever been a Mr. Maddox at all, or whether the name was borrowed like the cap. Suette asked her, pompous over his snuff, what hospital had bred her, and when she said she had nursed her own father and her own mother through their long dyings, and learned it so, he said, no training then, merely a family failing for death, and was vastly amused. Creel asked silkily, after her people, where were the Maddoxes seated, what were her connections, who would speak for her, knowing she had none to name, watching for the wince. And to every stroke of it she gave the same thing, the breath, the half-beat, the grey level eyes coming up, unhurried, and then 4 or 5 plain words with no heat in them and no plea, set down, quiet and entire, like a card laid face up on a table, so that there was never anything for the cruelty to catch upon and tear. She did not weep, and she did not flush above the faint flush that was always high on her cheekbones from the long nights, and she did not once, in all of it, glance toward the air for mercy. It was that, in the end, that pricked him, not her meekness, for she was not meek, but the absolute completeness of her composure, the way it closed over each unkindness like fen water closing over a thrown stone, smooth again in a moment with the thing sunk clean out of sight. He had come up to be diverted, and the diversion would not catch. Once, when Creel's pity grew too oily even for the air's idle taste, Adrian Ferrymore said, lazily, from his post against the bedpost, "Leave the woman her hands, Julian. She has more use for them than you have for yours," and laughed. But it was at his cousin that time, and not at her, and he caught himself doing it, and his dark brows drew down a moment in something he had not bargained for, and he pushed off the bedpost and went and stood at the rain-streaked window with his back to the room as though the marsh were suddenly worth his looking at. They wearied of it at last, as such company always does when the quarry will not run, and trooped down to their cards and their fire, Suette strutting, Creel lingering last with one long backward look at the medicines and the old man and the nurse, his small, close-set eyes thoughtful now and not amused at all. And the door shut, and the camphor dark came back, and Hester stood a long moment quite still with her chapped clean hands flat on the counterpane, breathing, before she stooped and asked the old lord softly if he would take a little of the warmed wine now that they were gone. He took it from her spoon, a sip, and another, and lay back, and for a while the fen afternoon drained grey to dark beyond the casement, and the candles were lit, and the house below settled to its laughter and its wine, and she sat the long evening through with her pocket-book knocking soft and secret at her hip, and her worn band catching the candle light as she turned the pages of the book she read him. It was deep in the night that he came clear. She had learned already, in her short days there, that the old man's lucid hours did not come by day with the doctor's draughts in him, but in the dead middle watches when the house slept, and the great clock on the stair told its slow strokes down the empty passages, and so it was that night. The candle had burned to a hand's breadth, and the rushlight beside it. The rain had thinned to a fine ticking on the leads, and old Lord Ferrymore opened his pale, watery blue eyes, and they were not wandering. They were sharp and present and fixed on her face, and he said, in a thread of a voice but a whole one, "You did not answer them back today." "No, my lord." "No," he said, and a ghost of the old shrewdness moved on his wasted face. "You let them think you are full. That is not foolishness in you, Maddox. That is patience. I have lain here 3 weeks watching you be patient, and I have come to think." He stopped, and his bony hand crept an inch across the counterpane toward hers. "I have come to think you may be the only soul under this roof I dare." She bent close and took the cold hand in both her own warm reddened ones, and waited, and did not press him. And that was the right thing, for he came on of himself. "There is a rot in this house," he said, very low, his eyes going once to the door and back. "Not the damp. The other rot. We have borrowed, Maddox, borrowed and borrowed, my brother before me and I after him, against these lands, against Marsh Carr and the home farm and the marsh closes and all of it, year on year. To keep the carriages and the cards and the wine you hear below, and it is all gone out upon paper now. All of it, the whole estate bound up in one great debt that someone holds, and I am too far gone and too much ashamed to set it straight. There is a bond, a mortgage, with the power in it to foreclose the whole, and the right in it to redeem the whole, and I do not." His breath caught and rattled, and he gripped her hand with a sudden wiry strength. "I do not rightly know whose hand it is come into. It was bought up. Quietly, through a man of business, a trustee, I was told, and I signed where I was bid to sign, because I trusted." And there he stopped himself, hard, on the edge of the name, and his eyes slid again to the door, and he would not say it, not even to her, not yet. "Trust no one in this house with it," he whispered instead. "Not the doctor, not my nephew, fond as he is and a fool with it. And above all," his grip tightened to pain, "above all, not my cousin's son. Not Julian. You hear me, Maddox? Whatever papers come to this bed for my hand, you are to read them to me first, every word, and if I am wandering you are to put them by, and let no man set a pen between my fingers. Promise me that. There is no one else. There is no one else." And she promised him, low and steady, holding the cold hand, her grey eyes never leaving his, and he sank back at last, eased, the dreadful grip loosening. And slept, and she sat on in the guttering light, with the whole frightful shape of it settling cold into her, knowing more now than he had said, knowing the very thing he could not bring himself to name, with the bond that was the rot's own cure, folded warm and silent against her hip. And she said nothing of that, either, but only watched the door. She was not, after that night, quite alone below stairs. Mrs. Druitt had been at the keyhole cold passage with a fresh ewer near dawn, and had heard, if not the words, the long low watching murmur of it, and had seen through the cracked door how the nurse sat the night holding the master's hand, and the spare upright woman with the iron grey hair and the deep kind brown eyes had said nothing then, only set down the ewer and gone. But at breakfast she carried Hester's bread and tea to her with her own hands instead of sending Jem, and stood by while she ate it, and said, abrupt and low, "He sleeps better for you." He has not slept, not real sleep, since Candlemas. And later, passing her on the turret stair, the housekeeper paused and looked her full in the face a moment, with those grave brown eyes, and said only, "There's them in this house, Mrs. Maddox, as I'd not trust to carry water, and you'll know which before long if you don't know already." And she went on down with her keys, and that was all, but it was a hand put out in the dark, and Hester knew it for one, and was glad of it as she had not let herself be glad of anything in that drowned, proud place. For the company did not go. Day on day the carriages stood in the coach-house, and the cards went on below and the wine, and day on day the old lord weakened, his lucid hours coming thinner and farther between, his pale eyes wandering longer, his bony hands plucking now at the counterpane in his sleep. And over it all Hester felt the whole smart household drawing in slow upon the bed, the way the fen mist draws in upon the causeway at evening, closing, narrowing, until you cannot see the firm road for the water. Sweat came twice daily now, and shook his head and spoke gravely of weeks become days. Crail came oftener than that. He took to drifting up to the sick-room door at odd hours, soft-footed, scented, the quizzing glass put away now, and his manner all silken solicitude, asking how his dear cousin did, lingering. His small, close-set eyes moving always over the night-table, over the inkstand, over the standish she kept there for the writing of the doctor's directions. And on the fourth such day, he came up not empty-handed, but with a slim leather portfolio under his arm, and an air of grave and tender business about him, and behind him a hired clerk-faced man she did not know. And he said, very gently, that there were one or two small matters of the estate his poor uncle had long wished to set in order, while his mind was yet clear, mere formalities, a renewal here, a confirmation there, nothing to trouble a sick man, and might they not be done now, this afternoon, while the light was good, and he laid the portfolio on the counterpane and drew out the papers and unfolded them by the bed, and dipped the pen, and held it ready over the old lord's plucking, wandering, half-conscious hand. She did not snatch the pen, for that was not her way, and a snatched pen would have told Mr. Crail at once that the nurse had read the papers and understood them, and she meant him to go on believing her a paid nobody who could neither read a deed nor count the cost of one. So she drew her slow breath instead, and lowered her grey eyes for that half-beat that always came before her words. And when she lifted them again, she had set her own chapped hand very gently over the old lord's wandering fingers, as if only to steady them, as a nurse might, and she said in her quiet level voice that his lordship was not in his hour for it. Mr. Crail smiled his ready smile above the gleaming flatness of his pomaded hair, and said that surely she mistook, that his uncle had a clear enough eye this afternoon. Look how he followed the light. And the clerk-faced man shifted his portfolio and looked at the floor. But Hester only kept her hand where it was, and said again, with no rise in her at all, that the old gentleman's mind came and went with the tide of the fever, that he had not known her own face for a good 2 hours, and that no signing done in such an hour would stand an honest morning's looking at, and she watched the small, dark, close-set eyes flick to her face and away. Crail laughed then, a light social laugh, and gathered up his papers as though the whim had passed, and tucked the slim leather portfolio under his arm, and went out with the clerk-faced man at his heel. But at the door he turned, and let the quizzing glass swing up on its black ribbon, and looked her over once, slow, from the plain cap to the flat black shoes, as a man prices a thing he means to be rid of, and she stood under the look, without moving, until he was gone. And when the latch had fallen, she sat down again by the great curtained bed and took the old lord's hot dry hand back into both of hers, and he turned his white head on the bolster, and his pale watery eyes cleared for a moment out of the fever and found her, and he knew her, and the corner of his wasted mouth moved, and he said, faint as a drought under a door, that she had caught the wolf at the fold again, and she answered that she had, and that he was to rest, and not to fret himself over Julian, nor over the papers, nor over any of it, for it was all of it safe in a place Julian could not reach. and the old man's eyes held hers, knowing exactly what place she meant. And he was content. And slept. That was the last of his clear hours that came by daylight. The fever took him hard that evening with the turning of the weather, and the storm that had been building grey and sullen all the week over the flat fen country came down on Marsh Carr in the dark, with a wind that leaned on the old walls, and a rain that drove level across the moat and rattled like flung gravel on the turret glass. Hester sat the long death watch alone through that storm. For the fashionable physician, Dr. Suet, had pronounced after his dinner that there was nothing further to be done, and had taken himself off to the warm parlour and his wine, saying over his shoulder as he went that the woman might sit with him. It was the sort of office she was bred to, and the heir kept to his own end of the house, and Mr. Crail was abroad on his own dark business, and so it was the plain grey nurse and no other who kept the candle burning through that wild night, and watched the slow, terrible labour of the old lord's breathing rise and fall against the booming of the wind. She did for him all the small faithful offices that the great folk would never think to name and never think to thank. She wetted his cracked lips with a rag dipped in barley water. She eased the wasted body on the bolsters when the breath caught and dragged. She warmed the bony hands between her own reddened ones when the cold of the end began to creep up into them. She spoke to him low and steady in the lulls, telling him there was nothing now to do but rest. And twice in the deep of the night the fever slackened its grip and let him up into one of his clear hours, and in those two quiet spaces between the storm's worst gusts the old Lord Ferrymore gave her, a little at a time, the small tender truths he had been keeping for her against this hour. He told her, his pale eyes steady on the candle, and his voice no more than a thread she had to bend close to catch, that he had wronged the boy, meaning Adrian, that he had let the lad grow up careless and proud and idle because it had been easier to laugh at his idleness than to mend it, and that the fault of what Adrian was lay as much in the uncle who indulged him as in the nephew, and that there was good metal under the idleness if ever it was struck hard enough to ring. He told her she was to be patient with the boy. He told her, with the ghost of his old sharpness coming up under the frailty, that Julian Crail had a clerk's hand and a thief's heart, and had been forging his uncle's signature these 2 years past on small things, a receipt, an order, a quittance, learning the trick of it against the day he should forge a great thing, and that he, the old lord, had known it and watched it and let it run, because a man who is dying may set a trap with his own slow ruin for bait better than a man who is well. And he told her, last and lowest, his long bony fingers tightening on hers with the queer strength the dying find, where the true papers lay, and what she was to do, and what she was on no account to do, that she was to hold her peace and hold the bond, and let the proud house turn her out without a word, and let Julian believe himself the master, and let the will be read, and the lands pass, and the foreclosure begin. And only then, when Crail had reached out his soft-scented hand to close it upon Marsh Carr, and thought the prize his own, only then was she to let it be known whose name truly stood upon the mortgage, so that the wolf should be taken in the very jaws of his own snare, and not 1 hour before. "Promise me," he said, "that you will not speak too soon out of pity for the boy when they put you into the rain. Let the rain fall on you. It is the price of the trap." And she promised him, holding both his hands, that she would not speak one word too soon, whatever they did to her. And he searched her grey eyes a long moment to be sure of her, and found her sure. And he sighed, and the sharpness went out of his face, and the long quarrel of his breathing eased, and a little before the grey light came creeping up cold over the drowned levels and the storm at last. blew itself out into a thin weeping rain, old Lord Marmaduke Ferrymore drew one long breath and let it go, and did not draw another. And Hester, who had closed many eyes, closed his, and folded the long bony hands upon the counterpane, and sat on by him in the quenched dawn, with her own hands still, and her grey eyes dry, keeping the first hour of his death as faithfully as she had kept the last of his life. They buried him 3 days after in the small fen church across the causeway, with the water standing in the churchyard between the leaning stones and the parson's words half lost in the wind, and the proud house came out in its blacks and went home again to the reading of the will. That was done in the long cold gallery at Marsh Car, where the light came grey and watery through the tall mullioned windows, and the dead lords looked down out of their dark frames upon the living, and a fire at the far end did nothing at all against the chill of the place. The lawyer from Lincoln read it standing at a little table with his back to the cold hearth, in the flat carrying voice of his trade, and Hester stood far back near the door among the upper servants, where a nurse paid by the week belonged, with Mrs. Druitt upright and grave at her side, and the boot boy Jem fidgeting against the panelling beyond. Adrian sat in the great chair near the table with his long legs out before him and his dark head bent. And for once there was no carelessness in him. He had not smiled since the death, and Crail sat at his right hand, sleek and soft and composed, his quizzing glass for once still upon its ribbon, his small eyes moving over every face in the gallery and counting, always counting. The will was an old man's will, and a plain one. It gave to faithful servants their small remembrances, to Mrs. Druitt a sum and her rooms for life, at which the housekeeper's lined face did not change. It gave the title and the hall and the whole of the Ferrymore lands, with all that stood upon them and all that lay under them, to Adrian, the dead man's brother's son and only heir. And then, in the careful guarded language of the law, it came to the matter that made the room go very still. For it spoke of the lands being charged, encumbered, the lawyer said, in his flat voice, with a mortgage of long standing and great amount, raised in the lifetime of the testator and several before him, secured upon the whole estate, with its interest fallen long into arrears, and the right of redemption resting in the air, and the power of foreclosure resting in the holder of the bond. The holder of the bond. The lawyer read the phrase and read on past it, for the will did not name the holder and was not required to. It only acknowledged that the debt was there, vast and real, a weight chained to the lands that the new lord inherited along with his title, and that whoever held the paper of it held a hand at the throat of Marsh Car. And not one face in that cold gallery turned toward the plain grey woman standing back by the door with her pocketbook knocking soft against her hip. Not one of them so much as thought of her. For who, in a room full of the great and the grasping, would dream that the nurse who smelled of camphor and tallow was the holder of the bond? Adrian lifted his dark head at the word mortgage, and a line came between his brows, and he asked the lawyer, lo, how great the sum was. And when it was named, the figure went round the gallery like a cold drought, for it was a ruinous figure, more than the rents of the drowned levels could clear in many years, and Hester saw the young man's weather-browned face go still and pale beneath the brown, as the full weight of his inheritance came home to him, that he had got a title and a great name, and a moated hall, and a debt that could swallow them all whole. But Crail leaned to his cousin's ear and murmured something smooth and steadying, and Adrian's face eased a little under the murmur, for the cousin was telling him, no doubt, what he had been telling him these weeks past, that the thing was managed, that the holder was known to him and would be dealt with, that Julian had it all in hand, and his lordship was not to trouble his head. And so the reading ended, and the company drifted out of the cold gallery into the warmer rooms, and the dead lord's truth went with them unguessed, the trap set and the bait laid, and the wolf walking easy in the very middle of it, sure of his dinner. It did not take the proud house long, with the old lord under the church floor and the will read, to remember that it had no further use for a nurse. The thing was done the same day, and done by Crail, who had taken upon himself already, with the new lord's careless leave, the whole ordering of the household, as a man orders what he means soon to own. He sent for her not to any private room, but out into the great stone-flagged hall, where the smart company was gathered idle after the reading, the fire smoking, Doctor, sweat warm with the dead man's wine, and pleased with the sound of his own voice, and there before them all Mr. Crail paid her off. He did it with his smooth forward courtesy, which was crueller than open insult, counting the weekly wage into her chapped palm coin by coin, and adding a shilling over with a flourish, for her trouble, he said, and the trouble had been considerable, he was sure, sitting up with a tiresome old man, and he told her, the quizzing glass swinging up at last to put the whole of her plain grey person under its round cold eye, that her services were no longer required at Marsh Car, that the house was in mourning and wished to be private, and that she would oblige them by taking herself off before nightfall, as the causeway was bad after the rain. Dr. Suet laughed his fat, comfortable laugh from the settle by the fire, and said it was wonderful how these women clung to a good place, and that doubtless the creature had hoped to be remembered in the will. Ha! A legacy for the camphor and the bedpan, and was put out to find herself only paid, and he took a leisurely pinch from his gold snuff-box, and looked at her down his fleshy nose to see how the shot told. And Crail smiled, and let it tell. Hester stood in the middle of the smoking hall, with the small heap of coin cold in her reddened hand, and the whole bright idle company turned to watch the nurse turned off, and she drew her slow breath, and lowered her grey eyes the half-beat, and lifted them, and said only, in her even unhurried voice, that she thanked them, and that she wished the house well of its mourning, and that she hoped the new lord would find his affairs in better order than he feared. It was a small saying and a quiet one, and it might have meant nothing, a servant's civil nothing on her way out the door, and Suet snorted, and Crail's smile did not waver, but Adrian, standing apart by the cold mullioned window, with his black armband on his sleeve and his dark hazel eyes on her, heard something in it, some level steadiness that did not fit a paid nobody being shamed in a hall, and for the space of a breath he looked at the grey woman as though he had not properly seen her before, and then the moment passed, and he said nothing, and let her go, and was ashamed afterward in the night that he had said nothing, so she went. She climbed the cold turret stair one last time, and gathered her few things into her bundle, and put on the dark grey wool cloak with its deep hood, and Mrs. Druitt came up after her, and stood in the low doorway with her keys still at her waist, and her thin firm lips pressed hard, and gripped the nurse's chapped hand in both her work-worn ones, and said low that it was a black shame, and that the old master would turn in his grave under the church to see his nurse put out in the wet like a tinker, and that she, Druitt, would not forget it. And Jem the boot boy was at the foot of the stair, with his sharp, freckled face all screwed up to keep from crying, and he carried her bundle down through the screen's passage and out to the door for her, though it was no part of his work, and Crail would have cuffed him for it. And at the door he looked up at her with his bright blue eyes brimming and his chipped tooth showing, and asked in a fierce whisper whether she was truly going for good, and she touched his straw-coloured head and said not so very far, and to keep the scalded hand clean and changed as she had shown him, and to be a good boy and watch the doors. Then she pulled the deep hood forward over the plain white cap and went out alone into the thin, cold, falling rain, and out upon the long causeway over the moat, with the grey water sliding flat and sullen on either side, and the reeds bending all one way in the wind, and the proud house of Marsh Carr stood up dark behind her against the streaming sky, and let her go, without a backward thought. Never once dreaming that the soaked grey figure dwindling along the causeway carried in the small worn pocketbook, knocking at her hip the one paper in all the world that could pull the whole of their lands and their proud name down into the fen. And she did not foreclose. And she did not flee. She did not turn at the causeway's end onto the Lincoln Road and take herself far away out of that drowned proud country as a sensible turned-off servant might. She walked instead the half-mile of muddy lane to the fen village that lay low among its willows within sight of the Marsh Carr chimneys, and there at the small inn she took a plain, clean upstairs room by the week. Paying for it quietly out of her own slender means, and not out of the great hidden thing at her waist, and from the low window of that room, across the wet willows and the flat shining levels, she could see the dark bulk of the moated hall she had been turned out of and could have ruined with a word, and there she settled herself to wait, with the dead lord's last charge laid like a cold hand on her heart, and his promise sworn on her lips, watching the house and the men in it, holding her peace and holding the bond. While Mr. Julian Crail, easy and unknowing a half-mile off, dipped his clerk's pen in the dark and bent his pomaded head and went on, quietly forging the dead man's name toward the foreclosure that he was so very sure would make him master of it all. And forge he did, in good earnest now, for the time of small forgeries was past, and the time of the great one was come. With the old lord safe under the church floor, and the will read, and the only honest watcher of the sick-bed turned out into the rain, Mr. Julian Crail judged that the field was at last clear, and he set himself to reap it with a clerk's patience and a thief's nerve. He did not move openly, for that was never his way. He moved as water moves into a low field, quietly, by every small channel at once, so that a man scarce sees it rising till it is at his door. He had the management of the whole estate now in his soft, scented hands, for Adrian, sick at the new weight on him and out of his depth in the very first hour of it, had been only too glad to let his clever cousin take the papers and the keys and the ordering of it all, and to be told that the thing was managed and his lordship need not trouble his head. And so the clever cousin sat long in the dead lord's own muniment room above the chill of the moat, with the iron-bound chests open about him and the candle burning down and the rain ticking on the glass, and there, with the dead man's old letters spread before him for copies and the very ink the dead man had used, he wrought at his great forgery, as a craftsman works at a thing he is proud of. He had been 2 years and more learning that wasted shaking hand, the long thin Marmaduke with its weak loop and its dragging tail, off 100 small receipts and quittances, and he could write it now in his sleep, fresh and strong, as the old lord wrote it 10 years gone, or faint, as he wrote it the last spring of his life, whichever served. And what he wrote, that long wet fortnight after the funeral, was ruin made legal. He drew up deeds of sale, fair and formal on good parchment, by which old Lord Ferrymore, in his lifetime and of his free will, had conveyed away the best of the outlying lands, the high pasture that alone stood dry, the 2 good farms that paid, the long plantation of timber that was the one ready wealth the drowned estate still owned, conveyed them all, for sums that were named and never paid, into the hands of strangers who were no strangers at all, but Crail himself under borrowed names and his creatures of business in Lincoln and London. He drew conveyances and quittances and acknowledgments, a whole quiet architecture of fraud. Each paper leaning on the last, and to every one he set the dead man's hand in the dead man's ink, dated cunningly back into the months of the old lord's failing, and witnessed, for he was thorough, by names of men conveniently dead or conveniently far off or conveniently in his pay. And he meant, when the lands were so stripped away and the carcass of the estate left bare, to come at the last upon the hall itself, for over Marsh Carr lay the great mortgage of long standing that the will itself had owned, the ruinous bond whose interest had run unpaid into a mountain of arrears, and Crail believed, for so he had taken pains to arrange the appearance of it, through the same trustees and men of straw he used for all his work, that the holder of that bond was a faceless lender he himself could treat with and buy out and stand behind, so that when the foreclosure came, it should be Julian Crowley, and no other, whose name closed like a soft pale hand about the throat of the house. He did not know, for it was the one thing in all his careful reckoning he could not know, that the trustee had been bought out months since by a quieter buyer than he, and that the bond he thought a tool in his own pocket lay, folded small in a worn brown leather pocket-book on a cord at the waist of the grey woman he had counted into the rain. He flattered the air to his face and stripped the lands behind it, and was very content, and went on forging. Adrian, meanwhile, felt the ground he stood on begin to give. He had come into his title in a daze of grief he had not looked to feel, for the careless idle man had loved his sharp old uncle more than he had ever troubled to say, and the empty rooms reproached him now with all the years he had laughed away, and into that grief there crept, slow at first, and then faster, a cold and rising tide of trouble that he did not understand and could not stop. Letters began to come across the causeway in the carrier's bag, stiff folded letters sealed by Lincoln attorneys and London houses, and they were all of them, under their courtesies, the same letter, that such and such a sum stood owing and was now called for, that the late lord had, by deed of such a date, sold and conveyed, that the writer must, with regret, press for an answer. Adrian read them in the cold gallery under the painted eyes of his fathers, and could make neither head nor tail of them, for he had never in his easy life kept an account, or read a deed, or asked where the money came that paid for his boots and his claret and his hunters in the stable. He had spent, as he had lived, carelessly, sure that the land was there, and would always be there behind him, broad and patient, and his. And now the land was sliding out from under him paper by paper, and he did not even rightly know how, and every man he applied to for the plain truth of it was Kral, or Kral's man, or a stranger who bowed and regretted and pressed. He rode out one grey morning to look at his own timber, the long plantation he had shot over since he was a boy, and found woodmen there he did not know, felling it, and a foreman who touched his hat civilly and showed him a paper, the old lord's hand plain upon it, selling the standing timber 2 years gone to a name Adrian had never heard, and Adrian sat his horse at the wood's edge in the thin rain, and looked at the bright wounds of the stumps and the wagons loading his trees. And something cold turned over in him. He went to his cousin with the letters and the tale of the woodman, and Crail was all smooth concern. The old lord, he said, had done many things in his last clouded year that it grieved them now to unravel, had sold and signed and bound himself in ways no one could have stayed. Poor failing gentleman, it was a sad tangle, but Julian had it in hand. And above all Adrian was to sign, here and here and here, these few papers Julian had drawn that would set things in some better order, and Adrian, who could not read what he signed and had no other counsel in the world, very near took up the pen. Very near. And it was in that hour, with the pen in his hand and his cousin's soft voice at his ear and the cold creeping up his spine. That the first true crack went through the smooth wall of Adrian's careless pride, for he looked down at the paper and could not understand a line of it. And he understood, with a flush of plain shame hotter than any creditor's letter had brought him, that he was a grown man, and a lord, and the head of an old house, and he was being led by the hand like a child who cannot read. And that the only soul under that roof who had ever looked at him without flattery and without fear, the only one who had spoken to him plain, had been a grey nurse he had let be mocked at his uncle's bedside and turned out into the wet without a word. He set the pen down. He told Crail, with a stiffness in his voice that was new and that made the small, dark, close-set eyes flick up sharp for an instant, that he would read the papers first, every one in his own time, before he signed. And Crail smiled and said, of course, his lordship was very right. There was no haste in the world, and gathered the deeds smoothly back into the slim leather portfolio and bore them off, and went up that night to the muniment room and forged 2 more. Half a mile off, at the low window of the inn that looked across the wet willows to the dark bulk of the hall, the grey woman was not idle either, though her work made no sound and left no mark and asked no pen. Hester Maddox waited, as she had promised the dead man she would wait, holding her peace and holding the bond. But waiting, with her, was never the same as doing nothing, and quietly, patiently, by every small honest channel as Crail worked by every dishonest one, she set herself to learn the true shape of what the cousin was building in the dark, so that when the hour came to speak, she should speak with the whole truth in her hand, and not a guess. She had 3 things that Crail, for all his cleverness, had altogether discounted, because they belonged to the world of paid nobodies he never troubled to see. She had Mrs. Druitt, and she had Jem, and she had her own clear, watchful mind that forgot nothing it had once seen. Mrs. Druitt came to the inn of an evening when the house could spare her, walking the muddy lane with a basket on her arm as though she carried broth to a sick body in the village, and sat in the clean, plain upstairs room with her keys in her lap and told the nurse, in her dry, grave voice, the small below-stairs truths that the great folk never knew were known. And the housekeeper had something better than gossip. She had memory, and she had the household's old paper. For 60 years the Druitts had served the Ferramores, and this Druitt had kept the still-room book and the household accounts, and the very dates of the house, in her tight iron grey head, and in a worn ledger of her own, and she could say to the day when the old lord had taken to his bed for good, and when his hand had begun to shake so that he could no longer write his own orders and Mrs. Druitt had written them for him to sign, and she had kept, folded in the back of her Bible because she threw nothing away, a sheaf of the old lord's own genuine letters and signed memoranda from across the years, the true hand in all its changes, early and late, strong and failing. These she brought to Hester. And Hester, who had her own quiet skill with a paper, spread the genuine letters out one evening on the deal table by the rushlight, and read in them the true story of a man's hand growing old, and saw at once, set against the dates Mrs. Druitt swore to, the lie that Crail was telling. For the housekeeper could swear that by the November of the year before, the old lord's hand had failed so far that he signed nothing without her arm to steady his. And yet Crail's deeds of sale, whose look Hester now began to learn through other channels, were dated bold and firm in that very season and after it, written in a Marmaduke too strong and too even for the dying hand the genuine letters showed. Written, in truth, by a man copying the old hand at its best, out of love of his own skill, and forgetting that the real hand by then was past such firmness. It was a small thing and a deadly one, and Hester marked it and said nothing and kept the genuine letters and the housekeeper's dates safe in her bundle against the day. And Jem watched the doors. The sharp-faced boot boy, who would have walked into the moat for the nurse who had bound his scalded hand and called him a good boy, took her last charge to heart and watched the doors of Marsh Carr with the bright patient cunning of a clever child whom no one notices. He saw who came and who went. He saw the strange, close-faced men of business ride over the causeway and be shut up with Mr. Crail in the muniment room. He saw the candle burn there late, and the slim leather portfolio go in full and come out fuller, he heard. Crouched small in the screen's passage, where a boot boy may always be, scraps of the smooth talk that drifted under doors, a name, a sum, a date, the word foreclose, the word holder, the word timber, and the half-penny's worth he could carry he carried faithfully down the muddy lane and poured out, breathless and proud, into the grey nurse's lap. From the boys watching and the housekeeper's dates and the genuine old letters and her own cool reading of it all, Hester built up in that plain inn room, square by patient square, the whole map of Crail's fraud, the lands he was stripping and the false deeds he stripped them by, and the men of straw he hid behind, and above it all his great mistaken design upon the mortgage. His sure belief that the bond was a thing he could come at and stand behind and use to take the whole. She saw the shape of his forgery laid clear against the one true paper in the world, the genuine bond folded in her own pocketbook, with its real right of redemption resting in the air and its real power of foreclosure resting, beyond Crail's reach or guess, in her. She saw that the cousin's whole edifice was a house built upon a stolen footing, and that one honest morning's looking, with the right papers in the right hand at the right hour, would bring the whole of it down on his pomaded head. And she saw, too, what the dead lord had made her promise, that the hour was not yet, that Crail must be let go on, and allowed to reach his soft hand all the way out and lay it upon Marsh Carr and feel the prize warm in his grip before the jaws of his own snare were let fall. So she held her peace and let the lands be stripped, and watched and waited. It was the church that brought them together again, for the small fen church across the causeway was the one ground where the Lord of Marsh Carr and the turned-off nurse might both lawfully stand. Hester went to it of a wet Sunday afternoon when the light was failing, not to be seen but for her own quietness, and knelt a while alone, and afterwards stood in the green dripping churchyard by the new-turned earth of the old lord's grave, where the water stood between the leaning stones, and there, coming alone and bareheaded out of the porch with his black band on his sleeve and trouble plain. On his lean weather-browned face, Adrian Ferrymore found her. He stopped when he saw her, the grey, cloaked figure by his uncle's grave, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the rain came soft between them, and the rooks went over crying in the wet elms. Then he came on, and stood, and looked at the heaped wet earth, and not at her, and said low, as a man says a thing he has been carrying, that he was glad to find her there, that he had thought of her, that he had not done rightly by her at the last, in the hall, and had known it that same night, and had let it pass, and that he was sorry for it. It was honestly said, and it cost him, for the careless proud man was not used to the words, and a week before he could not have brought them out at all. And Hester, standing very upright by the grave, with the hood fallen back a little from the plain white cap, and the loose strands stirring at her temples, heard the honesty in it, and was not moved by it to make it easy for him, because she had a colder and a kinder office to do than to comfort his conscience cheap. She drew her slow breath, and lowered her level grey eyes the half-beat that always came before her words, and lifted them to his face, and said in the same even unhurried voice that had never once risen at any cruelty done her under that roof, that his lordship owed her nothing and need not trouble himself, that she had been paid her wage and a shilling over for her trouble, and had taken no hurt that a turned-off servant does not look to take, and that if he was sorry it was not to her he should be looking, but to his own affairs, which stood, she said it plainly, her eyes steady on his, in worse order than he yet knew, and to the man at his right hand who was ordering them. He flushed at that, the quick blood up under the brown, half in shame and half in the old proud heat at being schooled by a woman in a wet churchyard, and he said, stiffly, that she spoke very freely for one who had nursed his uncle a few weeks and knew nothing of his family's matters. And she did not flinch from the heat, and did not answer it. She only looked at him a moment longer with that grave level look that had something in it he could not name and could not meet, some steadiness that made his stiffness feel like a boy's. And she said quietly that she begged his pardon, that she meant no freedom. Only that she had watched at his uncle's bed many long nights, and the old gentleman had spoken to her in his clear hours of more than his ailments, and that she would say only this and then trouble him no further, that he should read every paper before he set his name to it, every line, with his own eyes, and trust the reading of no man living, however near and however smooth, and that a house was not lost in a day, and might yet be saved by a lord who chose to open his own eyes. And before he could find an answer to that, she had drawn the hood forward over the white cap, and bent her head to him, civil and final, and turned and gone away light and upright through the wet grass, and out at the light gate into the falling dark, leaving him standing alone by his uncle's grave with the rain on his face and her quiet words working in him like a slow leaven, ashamed of his stiffness now as he had been ashamed of his silence before, and looking after the grey figure on the causeway with the first clear stirring in him of a thing that was not yet liking and was already more than respect, while half a mile on, warm in the lit muniment room with the rain on the glass, Mr. Julian Kroll dipped the dead man's pen once more, and bent his gleaming head and said, to the last and greatest of his false deeds, the firm, fair, forged Marmaduke that he was so very sure no living eye would ever think to doubt. The summons came 3 days after the funeral, on a morning when the fen lay drowned under a low white mist, and the moat stood black and brimming to its grassy lip, and it came not as a letter, but as a proceeding, for Mr. Julian Kroll had at last grown tired of patience, and meant the world to watch him take Marsh Car in broad and lawful day. He had chosen the long gallery for it, the great panelled room above the hall where the dead Ferramores hung in their dim gilt frames the length of the wall, and he had set out a long table at the upper end with green baize and inkstand and a great brass-bound box of papers. And he had filled the room as a man fills a theatre, for there is no pleasure in ruining a proud house unless the proud are by to see it done. The smart company that had baited the nurse at the sickbed were all assembled now in the cold daylight, the cousins and the connections and 2 or 3 from the county who had ridden over in their carriages through the mist for the sport of it. Dr. Pelham Sweat strutted at the window with his snuff-box catching the grey light, pursed and pink and well-pleased, his gold-headed malacca cane tucked under his arm, and Crail himself sat at the head of the table in his bottle-green coat a shade too rich, his pomaded black head gleaming, his quizzing glass on its black ribbon laid ready to his hand, turning over his false deeds with the soft, sure fingers of a man who has counted his winnings before the cards are down. He had brought a London attorney with him, a dry, close-buttoned man named Mr. Quill, to give the thing its colour of law, and he had brought the bond, or what he meant the room to take for the bond, and he had let it be known, with a great show of grieving reluctance, that the late lord's affairs were found to be in a sorrier tangle than any had dreamed, that the whole estate lay mortgaged to the chimney-pots, that the debt had fallen due and could not be met, and that he, Julian Crail, as the unhappy holder and assignee of that debt, had no choice in conscience but to enter upon his security and foreclose. He said it looking down the long room at Adrian, and there was honey in his voice and triumph under the honey, for this was the whole sweetness of it, not merely to take the lands, but to take them with the careless air looking on, to turn the new Lord Ferrymore out of his uncle's house with a bow and a regret, while the county watched the indolent young man who had never troubled to read a paper. In his life discover too late that his idleness had cost him everything. Adrian stood near the cold hearth in his dark coat, very still, his face grave and weather-browned, and harder than it had been a week before, the small old scar through his eyebrow white against the brown, and he said nothing at all, for he had learned in the rain at the graveside that there are silences worth more than speech, and he had learnt them, though he scarcely knew it, from a woman in a slate-grey gown. And Hester Maddox was in the room. She stood quite far down it, near the door, in her plain stuff gown and her large white apron and her close unfrilled cap, the worn brown leather pocketbook on its cord at her waist, her long reddened hands folded before her and perfectly still, and she had been sent for as one sends for a servant to bear witness or to fetch and carry. And not one soul among the bright company had thought to give her a chair. Sweat saw her by the door and tittered behind his snuff-box and said something low to his neighbour about the camphor smelling up the gallery, and a laugh went round, easy and cruel, the same laugh that had gone round at the sick-bed, and Hester drew her slow breath and lowered her grey eyes the half-beat she always took, and let it pass over her like weather, and waited. Crail rose and spread his soft hands, and began to read the foreclosure in his smooth carrying voice, the recital of the debt and the default, and the right of entry, the lawyer Quill nodding dry confirmation at his elbow, and the dead lords looked down from their frames, and the proud house came in those few minutes to the very edge of its ruin, and it was at that edge, with the word foreclose still warm on Crail's thin, too-ready lips, that the quiet legal turn began, and it began with so little noise that half the room did not at first understand that anything had turned at all. For there had come up the gallery, unhurried, a fourth man whom none of the company knew, a grave elderly gentleman in sober black, grey-headed, and clean and precise, who had ridden out from Lincoln that morning and waited below until his hour, and he carried a flat japanned deed-box under his arm and a single folded parchment in his hand. And he came to the foot of the long table and bowed to the room with great civility, and said that his name was Mr. Hartop, of Hartop and Spur, attorneys at law of the city of Lincoln, and that he came as trustee, and that before any gentleman foreclosed upon the Ferrymore estate, it might be convenient to all parties that the true mortgage be produced. There was a small silence. Crail's smooth voice stopped on the word it had reached. He turned his sleek head, and his small close-set eyes went narrow, and he said, with the first thin crack of impatience under the honey, that the true mortgage was upon the table before them, that he held it and had held it this 12-month, and that he did not know what trustee could come at this late day to muddy a plain matter of law. And Mr. Hartop inclined his grey head and said, very mild and very dry, that the paper upon the table was a thing he should be glad to examine presently, but that the genuine bond and mortgage of Marsh Carr, the original deed, duly executed, duly witnessed, and never assigned to any Mr. Crail at all had been, upon the late lord's own instruction in his clear hours, and through this trustee's hand, bought up quietly and lawfully more than a year since out of the several hands that held the scattered Ferrymore debts, gathered into one bond and vested, with its full right of redemption and its power of foreclosure entire, in a single name. And he laid the folded parchment open on the green baize and smoothed it flat with one careful hand, and the dry lawyer Quill leaned to it and read. And his close buttoned face went still, and Mr. Hartop lifted his grave eyes and let them travel the length of the long gallery, past the bright staring company, past the strutting physician at the window, past Krull risen half out of his chair, all the way down to the plain grey figure standing forgotten by the door, and he said, in the mild carrying voice of a man reading a fact, that the mortgage of Marsh Carr stood in the name of Hester Maddox, spinster, the nurse. The word went through the room like cold water through a crack. For one whole heartbeat, nobody moved. And then every powdered and pomaded and well-bred head in that gallery turned together, all down its length, to look at the woman by the door whom they had laughed at not 5 minutes since for smelling of tallow. And the mockery on their faces did not vanish all at once, but curdled, slowly, feature by feature, into blank astonishment, and then into something nearer fear. As the thing was understood that the nurse, the paid nobody, the chapped-handed creature in the stuff gown, held in her own person the whole fate of the house and every soul standing in it. Suette's snuff-box stopped halfway to his fleshy nose, and the snuff spilled grey down his straining waistcoat, and he did not feel it. Crail was on his feet now, both soft hands flat on the baize, his sallow face gone the colour of old wax under its cologne, and he said in a voice that had lost all its honey that it was a trick, a forgery, a clumsy imposture got up by an impudent servant and a country attorney, that no such bond existed, that his deed was the true deed, and his alone. And Hester Maddox lifted her grey eyes from the floor and looked at him steadily down the length of the gallery, and drew her slow breath, and said the first words she had spoken in that room. Then let the deeds be laid side by side, sir, and read, and let the witnesses be heard. I have nothing to hide in mine. I think you have a great deal to hide in yours. And it was done by parchment and by proof, in the end, and not by any stroke of force or flourish of spectacle, which was the whole justice of it, that the man who had ruled the house by paper should be brought down by paper, and the woman he had despised should bring him down by standing still and letting the documents speak. Mr. Hartop opened his japanned box, and the true bond was laid upon the green baize beside Crail's false conveyances, and Mr. Quill, who was an honest enough lawyer if a dry one, and had no wish to hang for another man's villainy, bent over the two, and went grey about the mouth, for the difference was plain to any clerk's eye once it was sought. The genuine deed bore the late lord's true signature, witnessed and dated in the proper season, the firm shaky hand of a sick old man set down before 3 named witnesses. And Crail's conveyances bore a Marmaduke Ferrymore too fair, too firm, too even, the firm, fair, forged hand of a man who had practised it warm and dry in a lit muniment room, and had grown so sure of it he had stopped doubting it himself, and they bore dates, those false deeds, that were the undoing of them. The here Mrs. Druitt was sent for, and came up the gallery spare and upright in her dove and black striped gown, with her chatelaine of keys at her waist, and her deep-set brown eyes very steady. And she had brought from the still-room press the things she had kept all these years as a careful housekeeper keeps them. The household book with its daily entries in her own neat hand, the old letters, the dated accounts. And she stood by the table, work-worn hands folded, and answered Mr. Hartop's quiet questions plainly and without heat, and her dates did the murdering of Crail's case as gently and as surely as a key turning in a lock. For one of his fine false conveyances was dated to a day in the autumn when, said Mrs. Druitt, turning to the very page, the old lord had lain 3 weeks senseless of a seizure, and could not so much as lift a spoon, far less guide a pen. The doctor from Lincoln in the house, and the whole servants' hall in fear of his life. And her household book said so in the ink of that same week, and the apothecary's bill bore the same dates. And the under-housemaid who had carried up the broth would swear to it, and another deed was dated to a week the old lord had spent, by the book and by the coachman's word, away at Bath taking the waters with Mrs. Druitt herself in attendance, 3 days' journey off, his hand 25 leagues from the muniment room, where his signature had bled so freely onto the parchment. The forger had been too greedy and too sure. He had wanted deeds enough to strip the lands to the bone, and he had dated them when it suited his scheme, and never thought that a grey old housekeeper kept a book. And now the book and the bond between them shut on him like a trap, the true deed standing honest, and witnessed against the false deeds standing dead men's signatures over the dead man's. Helpless weeks. Adrian had come forward from the cold hearth while the dates were read, and stood now at the table looking down at the 2 hands of writing side by side, the true and the forged, and the slow colour of a terrible shame and a terrible anger came up under his weather brown, for he saw written there in fair forged ink the full measure of the thing that had been done in his idle, careless house under his idle, careless eyes, his uncle's helplessness used as an inkwell, his lands signed away in a sick old man's senseless weeks, and he saw too, lifting his dark hazel eyes the length of the room to the still grey figure by the door, who it was that had sat through those same weeks at the bedside, and kept the truth, and saved the house, and what manner of woman they had all been laughing at. And there remained only Sweat to be unmasked, and he unmasked himself, as such men do, by his terror. For when the trustee turned mildly to the physician and asked whether the late lord had truly been, as Dr. Sweat had so often and so loudly declared at the sick-bed, of clouded and failing mind and unfit to order his own affairs in those last months, a thing Kroll had needed him to swear, to give his false deeds the colour of a sound man's free act, or to break the nurse's word if ever she should speak. The portly little man went from pink to a mottled grey, and his pouched cheeks shook, and he looked once, quickly in spite of himself, at Crail, and that one frightened glance told the whole gallery more than an hour's testimony. And then, seeing his patron's face turned wax and ruined, and no profit left in loyalty, Dr. Pelham Sweat did the meanest thing of his mean life, and saved his own skin. He set down his snuff-box with a clatter, and declared in a great unsteady bluster that he had been deceived, that he had spoken only as Mr. Crail had instructed him, that he had taken Mr. Crail's fee and Mr. Crail's word, and had no notion, upon his honour, of any forgery, and so confessed himself in the same breath a paid creature and a liar, and was believed, and was finished, and stood there exposed and abandoned at the window with the spilled snuff-grey down his waistcoat, and not one face in the room friendly to him. So the rot was laid open from end to end of the gallery, by document and by witness, and by the smooth man's own creature turning in his hand, and it was at this, at the very moment, the power of the house was seen to rest whole and entire in the despised nurse's hands, when she had every right in law and every reason in justice to foreclose upon the lot of them, and turn the proud company that had mocked her out into the white mist as they had once. Turned her out into the rain, that Hester Maddox showed them at last the only thing they had never thought to look for in her. For she did not foreclose. She came up the long gallery slowly, light and upright in her plain grey gown, past the staring frozen company that drew aside from her now as from something they did not understand. And she stopped at the table where the two hands of writing lay side by side, and she laid one chapped, reddened hand quietly flat upon the true bond, her own bond, the bond that held Marsh Carr in the hollow of her palm, and she looked not at Crail and not at the broken physician, but down the table at Adrian, at the new Lord Ferrymore standing shamed and grave and very still. And she drew her slow, steady breath and lowered her grey eyes the half-beat she always took before she answered any cruelty, though there was no cruelty now, only a room full of frightened, proud people waiting to learn what the nurse would do with them, and she said, in the same low, even voice with which she had borne every mockery at the sickbed, that the bond was hers, lawfully and wholly hers, and that she had no mind to use it as it had so nearly been used against this house. And the room let out its held breath as one, the long gallery shifting and stirring like a field of corn struck by a single gust, for they had braced themselves to be turned out as they had turned her out into the rain, to be stripped as Crail had meant to strip them. And instead, the nurse stood with her chapped hand flat upon the bond and offered them mercy in the plainest voice in the world. Krull did not stay to hear more of it. He had stood through the reading of the two hands of writing, with his sallow face gone the grey of cold tallow, his small, close-set eyes flicking from the forged signature to the true one, and finding no crevice to slip through. And when the attorney from Lincoln laid the old lord's genuine letters beside the deeds Crail had altered, and when Mrs. Druitt, upright in her dove and black gown with the household keys at her waist, set down upon the table the dated book of the old lord's own failing hand in which she had marked, day by day, which days he could hold a pen and which days he could not, so that every one of the forged dates fell upon a day the old man had lain too weak to sign his name, Crail understood that he was finished, and that no quizzing-glass raised to inspect his inferiors would mend it. At the threshold he turned, and would have said something venomous to the nurse, some last sleek cruelty, but Adrian was between them before he had drawn the breath for it. The new Lord Ferrymore grown suddenly tall and cold, and Adrian said only, very quietly, that Mr. Crail would be gone from Marsh Carr within the hour, and would answer to the law for the forgeries at the next assize, and that he might think himself fortunate the lady whose name was on the bond was a gentler creditor than he had been. So Crail went, his gleaming hessians clattering down the turret stair and across the causeway in the thin grey morning, and the fen took him as it took everything that left that house, swallowing the green coat a shade too rich into its mist, and the sneering fashionable physician doctor Pelham Suet, who had baited the nurse the hardest at the sickbed and had signed his self-satisfied name to certificates Crail paid him to sign, found his pomposity leaking out of him like air from a pricked bladder, and he too gathered his gold-headed cane and his gold snuff-box and strutted out a smaller man, knowing the physic he had practised on the dying old lord would bear no looking into, and that the nurse he had called a creature smelling of camphor and tallow had sat in judgment over them all, and had never once needed to raise her voice. And when the two of them were gone, and the long gallery emptied of its frightened, proud company, the house began, very slowly, to right itself, like a boat that has shipped water and rides up again as the water is bailed away. The wrong servants were set right first, for that was Hester's own asking before ever she would speak of the lands or the timber. The old groom Crail had turned off for asking after his unpaid wages was sent for and brought back, the dairymaid blamed for a theft that was Crail's own pilfering was cleared before the whole hall. The labourers whose cottages Crail had meant to pull down to sell the good fen oak over their heads kept their cottages and their oak both. Mrs. Druitt, who had been the first below stairs to take the nurse's part, who had carried the old lord's letters in her apron through all the danger and had never let the dates out of her keeping, was confirmed in her place as housekeeper of Marsh Carr, with her wages mended and a black silk gown promised her for the spring, and she wept once, briefly and upright, in the still room where no one could see her, and then went back to her keys. And Jem the boot boy, the household's small, warm heart, who had carried the nurse's notes folded small in his too big brown livery jacket, and had watched the doors she could not watch, and had run the muddy miles to fetch the Lincoln attorney with his scalded hand still bound in the linen Hester had wrapped it in, was called up before the new lord, and given a guinea and a place above the boot-room, and a promise of schooling, and he stood there with his straw-coloured thatch, and his chipped tooth grinning, and his snub freckled nose red with the cold, and could not for the life of him think what to say, and only looked at Hester, who looked back at him and let the corner of her wide, serious mouth lift the smallest part of an inch, which from her was as good as another's laughter. So the timber was saved, and the lands were saved, and the great moated hall in the Lincolnshire wetlands was saved, and the right of redemption and the power of foreclosure that had been bought up so quietly through a trustee and made over into the nurse's own name stayed in her own name, a sword she had carried sheathed through every mockery, and had drawn at last not to wound, but to shield. And through all of it Hester moved as she had always moved, light and upright in her plain slate grey stuff gown, the small worn brown leather pocketbook swinging on its cord at her waist, the thin worn silver band on her right hand, her capable reddened hands as quiet as ever, drawing her slow breath and lowering her grey eyes the half-beat before she answered. Though now what she answered was no longer cruelty but gratitude, and the gratitude of proud people is a harder thing to bear with grace than their scorn, and she bore it the same way, without a flicker, without a flush of triumph, as though saving a house from ruin were only another long night's watching come at last to morning. It was some days after, when Marsh Carr had grown quiet again, the assize business put in the attorney's hands, the company gone, the rain blown over, and a thin, clean April sun lying along the gallery floor, that Adrian found her. He had been seeking the words for it since the morning of the bond, and had not found them. For he had been all his idle life a man who reached for the light, easy thing to say, and there was nothing light or easy left in him to reach for. He came upon her in the old water garden below the south front, a place that had been let go to ruin in the old lord's long illness, the lead cisterns choked with last year's leaves, the box hedges grown shapeless and wild, the little canals where the fen water was let in and out gone green and stagnant, and she was standing at the edge of the lowest pool, looking at her own grey reflection in the still green water, and he stopped a little way off and watched her before she knew he was there, and saw, as he had never let himself see in all the weeks of mockery, how very tired she was, and how very alone, and how she carried both, as she carried everything, upright, without complaint, as a thing simply to be borne. "You might have spoken sooner," he said, and his voice came out lower and rougher than he had meant it. "Any hour of any of those days, you might have set the whole bond down on the table and stopped their mouths. You let them say what they said to you. You let me." And there he stopped, because he could not finish it, because what he had let the smart company do at his uncle's bedside, and what he had found diverting in the letting, rose up in his throat and choked him. She turned and looked at him with her level grey eyes, steady and unhurried as the day she had first come up the causeway, and she drew her slow breath, and lowered her eyes the half-beat, though there was no cruelty now to answer, and she said, "If I had set the bond down the first day, my lord, you would have done what was right by me, because you held the bond in your fear. I had rather you came to it, if you came to it at all, holding nothing." And that answer, which was no reproach, and yet was the heaviest reproach a man ever stood under, undid the last of the careless pride in him, and he came and stood beside her at the green pool's edge with his head bare and bowed, and said that she was right, that he had been a fool, and worse than a fool, a cruel, idle man who had laughed while a good woman was baited for her chapped hands and her plain gown and her want of family, and that he did not ask her to forgive it, only to believe that he knew it. And Hester, who had forgiven it already and long ago, in the small hours by the tester-bed when there was no one to see her do it, because she had learned that forgiveness ungiven sits in the breast like a stone and wears the heart away, said only that she believed him, and that the believing was enough, and that the old lord his uncle had thought better of him than he had yet thought of himself, and had said so in his clear hours more than once. At the name of his uncle, Adrian's hard-held face broke a little, and he asked her, for he had wanted to ask it since the day of the will and had not dared, whether the old man had suffered at the last, whether he had been alone, whether he had known anyone was by him, and Hester told him the truth, which was the kindest thing and also happened to be true, that the old lord had not suffered, that she had sat with him every night to the end, that he had held her hand in his long, bony hand and talked of the water garden as it had been when he was a boy. The box clipped, and the canals running clear, and the fenlarks going up over the green, and that he had not been alone for 1 hour, not one, and that the last thing he had said, the night before he died, with his pale, watery blue eyes gone clear, was that the house would come right, because there was one honest soul left under its roof. And Adrian understood then, fully and at last, that the one honest soul his uncle had meant was the nurse the whole house had despised, and that she had sat with a dying man to the end not because she held the bond, but because it was in her to sit with him, and that the bond had been a thing she carried for his protection and not for her gain, and that she had stayed her hand through all the mockery not out of cunning, but out of a deep, unhurried patience that wanted him to be a better man before she ever let him learn she had the power to make him a grateful one. And these things together worked on Adrian as nothing in his light, easy life had worked on him before, and he found, standing in the ruined water garden in the thin April sun, that he saw the nurse wholly clear at last, first as the only honest creature who had sat with his uncle to the end and saved his house from the men who would have torn it apart, and then, slowly, in the same hour, as something far dearer than that, a thing he had no leave yet to name, and would not for the world have frightened by naming too soon. So he named instead the smaller thing, and said that the water garden should be put right, the cisterns cleared, and the box clipped, and the canals run clean again as his uncle remembered them, and that he should be glad of her counsel in the doing of it if she would stay at Marsh Carr and give it, and Hester, who had nowhere else in the wide world she wished to be, and who had loved the ruined garden from the first for the old lord's sake, said that she would stay and give it. And so the spring went on into a green high summer in the fen, the longest and the kindest she had known, and the putting right of the water garden became the slow and unspoken putting right of everything else between them. They worked at it together through the long light evenings, she in her plain grey gown with her sleeves turned back and a smudge of green pond weed on her chapped wrist, he with his claret coat laid by on the box hedge and his shirt sleeves rolled, and the gold signet flashing as he heaved the choked leaves from the lead cisterns, and the children of the village, who had been told by their mothers that the nurse had saved the great house and their father's cottages and the good fen oak that roofed them, came shy and then bold to the garden wall to watch, and Hester, who had a gift with children that the proud company had never troubled to discover, set them carrying small stones to mend the canal edges and gave them bread and honey from Mrs. Druitt's stillroom and learned their names, and the boot boy Jem lauded it among them as one who had been in the thick of the great doings, and the garden filled up day by day with the sound of children, which is the sound a house makes when it has decided to live. And in the still warm dusks, when the children were gone home and the fenlarks had stopped going up and the first bats came out over the cleared canals where the water now ran sweet again, Hester would stand at the pool's edge where Adrian had first found her and look at her grey reflection, no longer alone in the water now, but with his dark head beside hers, and she would let herself feel. A little at a time, the way one lets warmth back slowly into a chilled hand for fear of the ache, what it had cost her to wait, the long nights of mockery borne with her eyes lowered, the rain on the causeway the day they turned her out, the bond carried like a coal in the breast that she might have spent on her own comfort 12 times, and never spent. The patience that had looked from the outside like meekness and had been the hardest courage she owned, and she found, turning it over in the cool fen dusk, that the waiting and the forgiving had cost her very nearly everything, and had bought, in the end, the one thing she had not known to hope for, which was not the lands and not the safety, and not even the vindication, but this: a man learning, slowly, in a green garden, to be worth the patience she had spent on him. As for his proud relations, who had drawn aside from her in the long gallery as from something they did not understand, the most of them were humbled into softness before the summer was old, for it is a wonderful solvent of pride to learn that the creature you despised holds your roof in the hollow of her hand and has chosen not to close it. And one by one the grand cousins and the fashionable aunts who had sat by while the nurse was baited found occasion to send her small civilities, a basket of hothouse fruit, a note in a fine hand, a call paid with too much warmth to be quite easy, and Hester received every one of them with the same level courtesy she had given their scorn. So that they went away not knowing whether they had been forgiven or merely endured, which was the exact truth of it, for she had forgiven them and was enduring them both at once, and saw no profit in telling them which. Only old Lady Ferrymore, the dead lord's sister, a sharp, upright dowager, who had said the cruellest thing of all of them at the funeral, came one evening to the water garden herself, leaning on her stick, and stood a long while watching the nurse kneel in the mended box and clip it true with the old shears, and said at last, in a voice gone unexpectedly unsteady, that her brother had always been a better judge of people than she, and that she was an old woman and had been a foolish one, and would the nurse, would Miss Maddox, give her her hand, and Hester rose from the box with the green on her wrist and the shears in her reddened fingers, and gave the old woman her hand, and drew her slow breath, and lowered her grey eyes the half-beat, and said that there was nothing to forgive that was not forgiven already, and the dowager held the chapped, capable hand in both her jewelled ones for a moment, and then let it go, and went away leaning harder on her stick than she had come, and did not say a cruel thing again in that house. And it was that same evening, with the dowager's carriage lamps dwindling away down the causeway into the blue summer dark, and the cleared canals lying still and bright as poured pewter, and the last of the children's voices long since carried off home across the fen, that Adrian came and found Hester once more at the lowest pool, and stood beside her, and looked not at the water, but at her, at the dark auburn-brown hair drawn smooth under the plain white cap, with the few loose strands escaping at the temples, at the level grey eyes and the wide, serious mouth, and the faint flush high on the weary cheek, and said, in a voice that had nothing left in it of the careless, amused man who had once found it diverting to let smart company bait a nurse, that he had a thing to say to her that he had been carrying as long as she had carried the bond, and longer, and that he was afraid of saying it badly, as he had done everything badly until she taught him better by doing everything well. And Hester turned from the still water and looked up at him with her unhurried grey eyes, and for once she did not lower them the half-beat before she answered, but kept them level on his face and waited, with her chapped hands quiet at her sides and her heart going hard under the plain grey stuff. For the proud, careless house had been saved, and the wronged set right, and the forger driven into the fen, and all that great reckoning was done and behind them, and there remained now only the smaller and the larger thing. The thing the old lord had foreseen in his clear hours when he gave the bond into her keeping, the thing that no power of foreclosure and no right of redemption had any writ to govern, waiting there between them in the warm fen dusk to be spoken at last aloud, and he said it plainly, in the end, as a man says a thing he has carried too long to dress up any further. The water garden lay all about them in the last of the light, the long lily channels that had been choked with weed and black rot, when first she came to Marsh Carr, now cleared and running clean, the green pads broad upon the dark water, and the first of the white flowers folding shut for the night, and the old stone water stair scrubbed, and the broken sluice mended, so that the moat no longer drowned the house, but lay round it like a bright girdle, and the swallows went low over the channels after the late flies. Adrian Ferrymore stood with his dark head bare, and his hands loose at his sides, none of the careless ease left in him now, only a kind of grave attention she had never seen in his face in all those first cruel weeks when he had lounged at the foot of his uncle's bed and found it diverting to let the smart company bait the nurse. "Hester," he said, "I am not going to speak to you of the bond. I have thought a great while how to come at this, and I will not have it tangled with the bond, for if I owed you only my lands I could pay you in lands, and that would be a clean thing and an easy thing, and I would have it done by a lawyer and be quit of it. But I do not owe you only my lands." He stopped, and she saw the muscle move in his strong, clean-shaven jaw, and the small old scar through his left eyebrow drew tight as a man's brow does when he is asking the one thing he is not sure he has any right to ask. "I owe you the sight of what a person may be," he said. "I sat in that room and laughed while they mocked you for your gown and your hands and your want of family, and you bore it without one unkind word and without once stooping to tell us what you were, and I thought you a meek creature, and you were the only upright soul under this roof, and I was the meanest. You taught me better, Hester, not by reproaching me, which you never did, but by doing everything well in front of a man who had done everything badly, and I find that I cannot do without the teaching, nor the teacher." And here, for all his resolve to speak it cleanly, his voice went rough. "I am asking you to marry me, not the woman who holds my mortgage, the woman who sat with my uncle to the last hour and closed his eyes and never told a living soul she could have ruined us all and chose instead to save us. I am asking her. I have no claim on her, and I know it, and I will stand here in the wet grass and wait however long it takes you to weigh whether a careless fool who has learned a little sense too late is worth your having." She did not lower her eyes the half-beat as she had done all those weeks before she answered any unkindness, that small habit of drawing her calm about her like the grey wool cloak before she let her words come. She had no unkindness to gather herself against now, only this, and she kept her level grey eyes upon his face and let him see her weigh it truly, because he had asked it truly, and deserved a true answer and not a quick one. The dusk thickened in the lily channels. Somewhere off across the fen a bittern boomed once, hollow over the reeds, and the water made its small, clean sound at the mended sluice. And she thought, in that long quiet, of the night she had come over the causeway in the rain with her one box and her camphor and her tallow, a paid nobody engaged to watch a dying man, and how the household had taken her in like a draught of cold air, and she thought of the old lord's clear hours, his bony hand on the counterpane closing over her, chapped one, his pale watery eyes gone suddenly shrewd and steady as he told her where the bond truly rested, and what manner of man his nephew might yet be made into if any soul had thee. Patience to wait out his folly, and she thought the old man had seen this very dusk from his bolsters, had foreseen it, had given the bond into her keeping not only to save his lands from Crail, but to set this proud, careless boy where he might at last be shamed into the man he was meant to be, and then loved into staying so. Adrian, she said at last, and it was the first time she had ever called him by his name and not his title, and she saw it go through him like warmth through cold hands. I have weighed it. I weighed it, I think, long before you asked, though I would not let myself know it, for it is a poor business to set your heart where you have no right to set it, and I had no right. She drew breath then, but not to steady herself against a blow, only because the thing was large. I will marry you, not because you owe me anything, for you owe me nothing the heart can be paid in, and I want no payment. I will marry you, because I came to this house to watch a man die, and found, God forgive the strangeness of it, that I had begun to live. And because you did not stay the man who laughed at my hands, a man who can be ashamed and mend is worth more to me than a man who never needed to be. Yes, I will have you. And he came across the wet grass to her and took both her reddened chapped hands in his lean weather-browned ones and bowed his dark head over them and pressed his mouth to the backs of them, to the very chapping and the thin-worn silver band where the smart company had sneered, and she felt his shoulders shake once, and she freed one hand and laid it on his bent head, on the thick, dark, overlong hair, the way she had laid it on the old lord's brow in his last bad nights, and they stood so a long while in the falling dark among the lily channels, and the white flowers shut. And the first stars came out one by one in the clean water at their feet. The bond was set right within the month, and set right cleanly, for Hester would have it so. There had been those, the lawyer chief among them, a dry, careful man come up from Lincoln, who urged that she hold the mortgage in her own name still after the marriage, as a wife's separate security, the lands being so lately snatched from the fire, and the memory of Crail's grasping so green, but she would not. She had not bought up the bond through the old lord's trustee to make herself a power over the house she was marrying into, and she said as much, plainly, across the long table in the cold estate room with its presses of deeds, with Mrs. Druitt standing grave by the door and Jem holding the candle-box. The bond, with its right of redemption and its power of foreclosure, the very instrument through which Julian Crail had thought to seize Marsh Carr, and through which instead he had been broken, was brought out and read once more in full, and then by Hester's own direction it was made into the marriage settlement of the estate, the debt cancelled, and the lands tied up clean and entire to Adrian and to the heirs of his body, with her own dower set within it. So that the thing which had so nearly drowned the Ferramores became instead the very deed that secured them past all future folly of borrowing. The lawyer drew the releases. The great mortgage deed that had hung over Marsh Carr for 2 generations was brought to the estate room hearth, and Adrian held it a moment. This paper that had nearly ruined his house, and had, in another's keeping, saved it. And then he laid it on the fire, and they watched the seal soften and the careful clerk's hand curl and char and go up the chimney in a single bright twist of flame, and Jem, who did not rightly understand the law of it, but understood a thing was ended, said, "There she goes then," in his sharp fen voice, and Mrs. Druitt, who understood the law of it very well, put her work-worn hand briefly over her mouth and said nothing at all, only her deep-set brown eyes were bright. As for Julian Crowley, he was gone past mending, and gone for good. The forgeries had been laid bare at the reckoning, the old lord's hand counterfeited a dozen times over on conveyances and notes of hand, the ink callus on Crail's own right forefinger and the very pounce and gall of his own writing-stand turned at the last into the proofs that hanged his scheme, and Dr. Pelham Suet exposed as his paid creature. The fashionable physician who had lent his pompous false authority to the cousin's plot and had led the baiting at the sick-bed for his fee, had bustled and blustered and at length his high colour gone grey, had made what terms he could, and removed himself and his gold snuff-box and his Malacca cane out of the county for ever. Crail himself had fled across the night fen with the foreclosure broken in his hands, and what the Marsh had made of him after that no one at Marsh Carr ever surely knew, save that a quizzing glass on a black ribbon was found in the spring, tangled in the reeds below the far sluice, and the boy Jem would not go near that reach of the dyke for a 12-month. But the lesser relations, the polished cousin who had sneered at Hester's plain stuff gown, and the careless aunts and the rest of the proud connection who had turned the nurse out into the rain on the day the will was read, these were not to be driven into any fen. These had to be brought round to civility, and they were, in time, and chiefly by Hester's own composure, which had never once broken under their cruelty and did not now break into any triumph over them. She received them when they came, as come they must, the new mistress of a house they had thought to inherit, and she received them with the same unhurried grey eyes, and the same wide, serious mouth held in its quiet calm, and she neither reproached them with the rain nor reminded them of the gown. And there is no weapon in the world a proud person can use against another person's settled kindness, so that one by one the smart company that had baited the nurse came, sourly at first and then less sourly and at the last almost gladly, to sit at her table and call her cousin and own, when they were honest, that the house had got a better lady than ever it deserved. They were married in the autumn, when the lily channels had given over flowering, and the fen lay gold and brown under a wide, pale sky, at the small grey church that stands out on the dyke a half-mile from the hall, the low square Norman tower of it weathered to the colour of the marsh itself, the churchyard ringed with leaning stones, and a single bent thorn. There was no smart company brought up from town for it, no fashionable crush. Hester would not have had it so, and Adrian, who a year before would have made it a great careless show, wanted now only what she wanted. The village came, and the household came, and that was the church full. Mrs. Druitt, in a new dove-grey gown, but her own chatelaine of keys still at her waist, for she would not be parted from them, even to be wed by proxy of her lady's joy, stood up among the household with her long, lined face working, for she had served the old lord 40 years, and had been the first below stairs to take the nurse's part, and she had prayed for some such day without daring to name it, even to herself. Jem, scrubbed pink and near, throttled in a new livery that for once was not too big for him, had the office of opening the church door and could not keep from grinning his chipped tooth grin at every soul who passed, and stood through the whole service craning to see, and wept without in the least knowing he did it when the ring went on. Hester came up the dyke path on no one's arm, for she had no family living to give her, and she had thought once that this would be a loneliness on such a day, but the whole Fenside village had turned out along the path, the women bobbing and the old men pulling their forelocks, the fen reeves and the eel men and the children with late Michaelmas daisies pulled from the dike banks. And she walked up through them in a gown of soft grey silk, grey still, for she would be married in no other colour, only this was silk and not stuff, and at the throat of it was the narrow band of plain white linen she had always worn, kept for love of the woman she had been. And her dark auburn brown hair was dressed smooth and low as ever, but with a wreath of small white late flowers from the cleared water garden set upon it in place of the plain close cap. And she was, the village said after at the ale, the quietest and the comeliest bride the fen church had seen in living memory. And Adrian, waiting for her within the cool dim church under the old hammer beams, watched her come up the aisle with the marsh light behind her, this woman of 28, who had come to him a paid nobody smelling of camphor and tallow, and who was now to be Lady Ferrymore, and the saving of his house, and the keeping of his heart. And he thought he had never in his idle, careless life seen anything he so little deserved, and so wholly wanted. And when she reached him, and put her chapped, capable hand in his, he held it as though he had been given the whole world in it, which, as he had come to reckon the world, he had. And the years that followed at Marsh Car were good years, and quiet ones, which is the best thing that can be said of years. The moated house that had been half drowned and rotting under the weight of old debt and old cruelty came alive again under its new mistress. The lily channels ran clean every summer, and the white flowers opened on the dark water, and the great tester bed where the old lord had died was aired and curtained fresh, and slept in by the living. And in its time a child was born in that house, and then another, and the long turret stair-up which Hester had once climbed shivering in her grey cloak to a dying man's vigil rang now with children's feet. She kept all her life the small, worn brown leather pocketbook on its cord, though she had no more cold vigils to set down in it, and she kept her chapped hands busy about the place, for she could no more sit idle and be waited on than she could fly. And the village loved her for it, the lady who would still bind a scalded hand or sit a night through with a sick child as readily as she had sat with the old lord. Mrs. Druitt lived on to a great age in honour at the Hall, and died at last in her bed with her lady's hand in hers, and Jem grew up to be the trustiest man on the estate, and would tell the new young grooms of an evening, with his chipped tooth and his fen-sharp voice, how the proud house had once turned the kindest soul in England out into the rain, and how she had held its very life in her hand, the whole while, and never said a word, and saved them, and married the heir for no reason on earth, but that he had been man enough to be ashamed, and the young grooms never quite believed the half of it, but it was every word true. If this story warmed you, if you believe that quiet steadiness outlasts every cruelty, and that the gentlest heart is so often the strongest, then stay a while with us here at Whispers of Love, subscribe, and let the next story find you. For Mockery Met with Grace had won, in the end, the only victory worth the winning, and Marsh Car, no longer drowned but living, kept its lady to the last of her days, the nurse they had despised, who could have ruined them, and chose instead to be their saving and their joy, walking out at evening among the flowering lily channels on the arm of the lord who had learned, almost too late, and then in time, to love her.